One founder, John Adams, a signer of the Declaration, had suggested that our Constitution was made for a religious and moral people, wholly unsuitable for any other. However, during the decade preceding the pandemic, the churches had been in a sharp decline, falling in membership by as high as 12% over the past decade, and post-pandemic, the churches have lost even more, 6%, or half the losses that had been experienced over the prior decade, so that today, causing for some reason for boast, while for others some trepidation. But fundamentally are the words and thoughts of John Adams, for a living document, as some have described, of any particular relevance and importance, today. That was then, and this is now. Does anything last forever? What do you think? We'd like to know. This is something about which, at least, a thinking person should dedicate some considered thought. Our Constitution was made for a religious and moral people, wholly unsuitable for any other. What do you think? We'd like to know. Will that government of the people, by the people and for the people ever perish from the earth? Does it pose a danger greater than even melting polar caps, greenhouse gases, pandemic viruses, war, famine, international trade agreements, taxation or even voting? We have often heard that democracy is at stake. What do you think? We'd like to know. Consider this. Every school child has probably learned what most at least educated adults should know when the topic of civil rights or human rights arises, even if the degree of comprehension may vary from person to person. And, especially in a contentious body politic, we are often inundated with discussions about rights, in dutiful exercise or unlawful and heinous violation. What do you think? We'd like to know. Similarly, most should be at least a bit acquainted with the phrase that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights. And, by rote memory, you should be capable, with great facility, to rattle off machine gun style the top 3 basic constitutional rights, and if not, perhaps life, liberty and what has been described as the pursuit of happiness, a rather vague phrase far more understood by attorneys than laymen, as a legal term of art, which may not quite align with that conception you might hold in your head. And, some may recall from studies in school that originally the phrase had been rather different, recognizing inalienable rights of life, liberty and property, and most people are acquainted with some sense of a right of property, finders keepers, possession is 9/10 of the law, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. It's really not rocket science, and rather easy to understand, unless one were to introduce some twist to create some tension, as had been the case for the peculiar institution of American chattel slavery, a topic of great controversy for decades in the courts, culminating only slightly in the American Civil War, but still with remaining vestiges of tension that shape American politics today. What do you think? We'd like to know. Nonetheless, one thing that should be well understood is that these inalienable rights are distinct from what is often described as statutory rights, perhaps even simply grants of privilege, or those rights that arise because of legislation or government decree, like a driver's license, or even access to documents under something like the Freedom of Information Act, and, as one might reasonably assume, to the extent that nothing lasts forever, and that power placed in unworthy hands may be abused, that which a government can give, or provide, it can, with equal effortlessly also take away, depriving you of what had been formerly a grant of broad license in free enjoyment. What do you think? We'd like to know. And so, accordingly, what must be understood from this rather academic distinction is that these human rights or civil rights possess a higher ordered precedence over statutory rights, and are considered, at least generally, to be inviolable, warranting higher safeguards or protections to ensure that they are not abridged, infringed upon or violated. Life, liberty, and these bundle of rights that we find in the Bill of Rights, such as free exercise of religion, prohibitions against an established church, free speech or the press, due process, a right to confront one's accusers, a right against self-incrimination, right to an attorney in a criminal proceeding, a right to a speedy trial, a prohibition against double jeopardy, cruel and unusual punishment, and excessive fines, and what have you. And, most important to remember about the Bill of Rights is that distinct from those statutory rights brought into existence by the government that can be taken away on some political fancy or whim, the Bill of Rights is only official acknowledgement of these civil or human rights, inalienable, that persons are assumed to already possess, which makes the source of law, or proximal origin, from which these rights are derived a rather important fundamental question, from a jurisprudential perspective, or those matters with which attorneys and jurists are confronted in the courts. What do you think? We'd like to know.
This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.